4:47 a.m. Marion County, Florida. A dispatcher at the Ocala substation reads a plate number into the radio. 2 seconds of static. Then a deputy on Highway 40 comes back. The truck just blew through a stop sign at the intersection of County Road 314 and Baseline Road, heading south. No brake lights. Fast. The deputy hits his lights. The truck accelerates. What began as a traffic stop on a rural Marion County 2-lane at 4:47 in the morning on October 14, 2025, would not resolve for 87 days. When it did, 7 young women, ages 22 to 26, were carried out of a converted root cellar beneath a farmhouse that most people in Marion County had never thought about twice. One propane delivery cracked the case. The Amber Alert chase forced the raid 3 days early. This is how it happened. The farmhouse sat on a parcel of agricultural land off a county service road outside Ocala, Florida. Satellite imagery showed a chicken coop along the east fence line, a rusted tractor that hadn't moved in years, and a hand-painted mailbox at the end of a gravel drive. The property was listed in county records as a short-term agricultural rental. The tenant of record was a man named Calvin Dutrow, except Calvin Dutrow had died in Alachua County in January 2024. Someone had been paying the monthly rental using a money order, signed with a dead man's name, dropped in the property management company's after-hours slot on the 1st of every month. The name on those money orders wouldn't surface until December. The woman who set everything in motion, though she had no idea she was doing it, was named Renata Olave, 24 years old, a hospice care nurse from a small town outside Gainesville called Newberry. She drove a white Honda Civic with a cracked left rear taillight, had a savings account she'd been adding to for 18 months to pay for a clinical nurse specialist certification course, and she called her mother every Sunday without fail. The last call was Sunday, October 12, 2025. She never called the following Sunday. When her mother drove to her apartment in Newberry, the Honda was parked outside with the engine cold, the front door unlocked, and Renata's phone on the kitchen counter, plugged in and charging. Her scrubs from the previous Friday shift were folded on the arm of the couch. A half-finished cup of coffee sat in the dish rack, rinsed but not put away. Her work badge for the hospice facility was clipped to the strap of her tote bag, which was hanging on the hook beside the front door. Everything in the apartment said she had been home and expected to come back. Nothing said goodbye. Marion County Sheriff's investigators opened a missing persons case that afternoon. A hometown vigil in Newberry drew about 100 people the following Thursday. Her picture ran in the Gainesville Sun and in the Ocala Star Banner. Her parents drove the 40-minute route between Newberry and Ocala every weekend, looking at nothing in particular, looking anyway. Her father kept a notepad on the passenger seat and wrote down anything that seemed worth writing down: road names, gravel turnoffs, gates that looked recently used. None of his notes connected to anything. He kept writing them anyway. By December, the vigils had stopped making the local news. The first anomaly had nothing to do with Renata Olave. It was a propane delivery record. A federal investigator assigned to a fugitive warrant case in Marion County, a separate matter involving an individual wanted on a wire fraud charge out of the Northern District of Florida, was doing routine background checks on rural properties in the county. The fugitive had ties to agricultural rentals. The investigator requested Marion County property records for short-term agricultural leases with no permanent occupant on file and cross-referenced them against utility and delivery records. The farmhouse on the service road came back with something unusual. A 400-gallon propane delivery had been made to the property on September 2, 2025. The property was classified as a residential agricultural rental, with no current occupant on file. The management company's records showed the tenant had last been verified in person in March of that year. A vacant property in July and August, two of the hottest months in Central Florida, doesn't need 400 gallons of propane. Propane in Florida heats water and runs stoves. A vacant structure uses neither. The investigator noted it, flagged it, sent it to a task force coordinator. That flag sat in a task force inbox for 11 days. Here's what makes this case difficult to understand. The system was working, just slowly. The flag didn't disappear. A coordinator named, in case documents, only by her initials, LM, pulled the flag on October 2nd, cross-referenced it against the missing persons registry for Marion and Alachua counties, and found 3 open cases of women reported missing from properties within a 40-mile radius. None of the missing persons cases had any documented connection to the farmhouse. There was no evidence yet. There was one anomaly, a propane delivery that didn't fit a vacant property, and 3 unrelated missing persons files. That was enough to open an inquiry. Not enough for a warrant. The investigator requested surveillance authorization for the access road to the property. It was approved on October 9th. Remote camera coverage was established on October 11th, covering the gravel drive and the mailbox. The cameras were motion-activated, positioned inside the tree line at 2 points along the drive, and connected via encrypted cellular relay to a monitoring terminal at the task force field office. In the 3 days between activation and the morning of the 14th, the cameras logged 14 motion events. 11 were deer. 2 were a utility truck from a power company, servicing a line on the adjacent parcel. 1 was a dark-colored pickup that came down the drive at 11:40 p.m. on October 12th, stayed for approximately 40 minutes, and left without its headlights on. The plate wasn't readable in the available light. The footage was flagged for enhancement and sent to the field office the following morning. It was still in the enhancement queue on the morning of October 14th, when the Amber Alert went out. The Amber Alert issued by Marion County on October 14, 2025, was for a different case entirely. A young woman named Simone Batiste, 23 years old, reported abducted from her apartment in southwest Ocala. A witness had reported seeing her pulled toward a dark pickup truck at approximately 11:15 the previous evening. The witness had a partial plate. Law enforcement ran the partial, got several candidate vehicles, and one of them, a dark gray Ford F-250, came back registered to a business entity whose registered agent was listed at an address in Levy County. At 4:39 a.m. on October 14th, the Marion County Dispatch received a call from a deputy on Highway 40 who had spotted a dark gray Ford F-250 with no front license plate running a stop sign at high speed. The deputy called it in. Dispatch ran the rear plate. It matched one of the Amber Alert candidates. The deputy activated his lights at 4:47 a.m. The truck ran. What followed was a pursuit that covered 11 miles of rural Marion County roads, at speeds ranging from 60 to 90 miles an hour, with 2 Marion County units and a Florida Highway Patrol trooper joining the chase. The terrain worked against the pursuing units in the early minutes. The 2-lane county roads through that part of Marion County run straight for long stretches, then bend hard without warning, and the F-250's driver knew them. He cut south off Highway 40 onto County Road 314, then east onto 314A, a narrower road with degraded shoulders and no lighting. The pursuit supervisor twice considered calling it off for safety. He didn't, because Simone Batiste was somewhere in that truck, and the Amber Alert was less than 5 hours old. The truck skidded off County Road 314A at 5:03 a.m., left the pavement on a curve, and went into a drainage ditch approximately 3 miles from the farmhouse on the service road. The driver, a man the task force would later identify under the name Garrett Knowles, a composite identifier used in case filings, exited the vehicle and produced a firearm. Deputies fired. Knowles was pronounced dead at the scene at 5:19 a.m. Simone Batiste was recovered from the rear cabin of the truck. She was bound at the wrists with zip ties and had duct tape residue on her jaw consistent with a gag that had been removed. She was transported by ambulance to a hospital in Ocala. She was alive. The pursuit was over. But the farmhouse was 3 miles away. The task force coordinator, LM, received a call from a Marion County detective at 5:42 a.m. The detective told her the dead man's vehicle had been recovered near the service road leading to the agricultural property under inquiry. He read her the address from the truck's GPS navigation history. The farmhouse was listed as a recent destination, 3 visits in the preceding 11 days. LM escalated immediately. Here's what took nerve. The surveillance authorization on the property was active, but there was no warrant to breach. Applying for a warrant at 5:45 in the morning, based on a dead man's GPS history and a 400-gallon propane anomaly from 6 weeks prior, would take time. A federal magistrate would need to review the application. The task force estimated 4 to 6 hours minimum. Every hour felt like a problem no one could quantify. The application was filed at 6:08 a.m. The magistrate was reached by 6:20. The task force coordinator, the case agent, and a supervisory deputy marshal were on a conference line by 6:35, reviewing the affidavit in real time. The application cited the GPS navigation history linking Knowles to the property on 3 recent dates, the propane delivery anomaly from September, the proximity of the property to the missing persons cases in Marion and Alachua counties, the unlit headlight vehicle captured on the surveillance camera on the night of October 12th, and the fact that the property tenant of record had been deceased since January 2024. The warrant was signed at 7:51 a.m. on October 14th, 2025. 126 minutes from application to authorization. That is fast. What no one on the task force knew at the time was how fast it needed to be. While the warrant application was being processed, 2 task force members and a Marion County K-9 unit were staged on the perimeter road adjacent to the property, maintaining observation without approach. The K-9 handler noted at approximately 7:15 a.m. that the dog was alerting toward the property line from a distance of roughly 200 yards. The handler logged it. He didn't move closer. The warrant hadn't yet been signed. Protocol held even at 7:15 in the morning with a dog alerting at 200 yards. That discipline, holding the perimeter for 36 more minutes until the warrant came through, isn't a small thing. It's the difference between an admissible prosecution and a suppression hearing. Everyone on that perimeter road understood it. Nobody moved. Put yourself in the position of the agents staging on the perimeter road at 8:04 that morning. They had a signed warrant. They had a property with no confirmed evidence of occupants. They had thermal imaging that showed heat signatures inside the main structure, faint, multiple, low to the floor. They had no floor plan for what was below ground level. Nobody had a floor plan for what was below ground level. The entry team was composed of Marion County Sheriff's Office deputies, 2 U.S. Marshals Service fugitive task force members, and a 4-person FBI hostage rescue team element that had been staged in the region as part of the fugitive warrant operation already in progress. Total stack, 11 personnel. The breach was initiated at 8:17 a.m. The front door of the farmhouse wasn't reinforced. The interior of the structure was consistent with a low-use rural rental, minimal furniture, no refrigerator contents, a propane range with a tank connector running through the exterior wall. No persons in the main structure. The agents cleared room by room in under 90 seconds. The farmhouse was 4 rooms wide and 1 story. There was a folding table. There was a metal chair. There was a cot frame with no mattress. On the propane range, a single burner had been used recently enough that grease residue was still tacky on the grate. Someone had cooked a meal in this room not long ago. The padlocked door was in the back hallway. A standard residential interior door, fitted with an exterior-grade hasp and padlock, the kind of hardware you find at any farm supply store. The agent's photographs, later submitted into evidence, show the hasp was steel, lag-bolted through the door frame into a reinforced backing plate. Someone had done the work carefully. The lock hadn't been added as an afterthought. The backing plate was countersunk flush with the door frame trim. If you weren't looking for it, you might have read the door as a utility closet. The agents were looking for it. The agent at the door called out, announced agency affiliation, and waited 4 seconds. From the other side of the door, sound. The lock was cut at 8:22 a.m. Stairs led down approximately 8 feet into a converted root cellar, a structure common in older Florida agricultural properties, originally used for cool storage before modern refrigeration. The cellar had been modified. The walls had been lined with plywood sheeting. There were portable lighting fixtures, 2 of which were still running on a battery pack. There was a chemical portable toilet. There was bedding. There were water containers, 5-gallon jugs, several of them empty, lined against the east wall. There were food wrappers. There were 7 plastic bins that had held dry goods. The floor was packed earth covered with 2 layers of commercial rubber matting. Someone had organized the space with deliberate, awful functionality, as though the goal had been sustainability rather than comfort, endurance rather than humanity. 7 young women, ages 22 to 26. The case file doesn't describe what the agents said when they entered. It documents, in clinical notation, 7 adult female subjects recovered from a subgrade residential space, consistent with prolonged confinement. All 7 were ambulatory. All 7 were transported by EMS to 2 receiving hospitals in Marion and Alachua counties for evaluation and treatment. No press conference was held for 48 hours following the recovery. What the clinical notation cannot carry is the 4 seconds that elapsed between the lock being cut and the door being opened. The agent who cut the lock later stated in an interview with the task force's after-action review team that he had done several hundred warrant executions in his career. He said he had never had 4 seconds feel like that. He said he didn't elaborate further and the review team didn't press him. It is in the after-action notes as a single line. It stays with you. Renata Olave was among the 7. She had been missing for 87 days. Her parents were reached by a Marion County victim advocate at approximately 10 a.m. Her mother later told a Gainesville journalist that the phone call consisted of 3 words before she couldn't hear anymore. The recording of that call is not part of the public record. The investigation that followed had 2 directions simultaneously. Who was Garrett Knowles, and how many people knew about the farmhouse? The name Knowles was, as it turned out, one of at least 3 identities the deceased had used across Marion, Levy, and Alachua counties over a period of approximately 22 months. The business entity listed as the registered agent for his truck's license plate, a landscaping company incorporated in Levy County in March 2024, had never filed a tax return and listed a P.O. box as its only address. Investigators identified a second vehicle registered to the same entity, a white Dodge van, last seen, according to toll records, on State Road 200 on October 9th, 5 days before the pursuit. The van had not been located as of the date the arrest warrant was issued. That detail, One vehicle, unaccounted for, belonging to the same entity as the dead man's truck, meant the task force couldn't confirm whether Knowles had been operating alone. He hadn't. In the days immediately following the October 14th raid, investigators worked backward through the financial architecture that had supported the operation. The money order trail for the rental payments was traced through 4 separate post office locations in Marion and Levy counties. Money orders in this context are deliberately chosen instruments. No account number, no routing trace, purchasable with cash at any grocery or convenience store. But they aren't invisible. Each money order has a serial number embedded in its paper stock, and each serial number corresponds to a point-of-sale transaction at the issuing retailer. Investigators subpoenaed point-of-sale records from 7 retailers across the 2 counties. The records showed that the money orders used to pay the farmhouse rent had been purchased on a rotating basis from 4 different locations, never the same store twice in a row, always with cash, always just under the transaction threshold that would trigger an automatic suspicious activity flag. Whoever was managing the finances knew what the flag threshold was and stayed below it. That level of operational awareness doesn't come from nowhere. The investigation spent the next 19 days reconstructing the network. The financial architecture was thin: money orders, cash, entity registrations using deceased persons' identities. But it left tracks in county clerk records and in the invoicing system of the propane supplier. The propane company's delivery logs showed 3 prior deliveries to the farmhouse property over the preceding 18 months. Each one logged under a slightly different spelling of the tenant name, but billed to the same account number. That account had been opened in person at a dealer in Inverness, Florida in April 2024, by a man who signed a name that matched neither Knowles nor Dutro. A surveillance camera at the propane dealer's counter had recorded the transaction. The image was recoverable. The composite led investigators to a second individual, identified in case filings only as Subject 2, who had been present at the farmhouse property on at least 4 occasions prior to the October 14th raid, based on cell tower location data obtained under a court order. Subject 2's phone placed him within 800 meters of the service road on September 1st, the day before the 400-gallon propane delivery. It also placed him within the same radius on October 3rd, October 7th, and October 11th. October 11th was the day the surveillance cameras went active on the driveway. Subject 2's visit on that date was the one the cameras didn't catch. He had arrived before the cameras were operational by approximately 3 hours, according to the cell data, and departed before the installation team arrived. 3 hours. The cameras went live, and Subject 2's last documented visit to the property had been 3 hours earlier that same day. Whether that was coincidence or awareness is a question the investigation examined carefully and couldn't conclusively answer. Subject 2 was located in Hillsborough County on November 3, 2025. He was arrested at a truck stop on Interstate 75 by a joint team of Hillsborough County deputies and U.S. Marshals. The arrest was conducted at 6:40 a.m. while Subject 2 was eating breakfast at the truck stop's counter restaurant. He was seated, mid-meal, when agents approached from 2 directions simultaneously. He looked up, set down his fork, and said nothing. He didn't attempt to flee. He was transported to the Middle District of Florida for federal proceedings. He didn't speak during booking. He asked for an attorney at the first opportunity. A federal indictment was returned on November 19, 2025, charging Subject 2 with conspiracy and additional federal counts tied to the confinement and transportation of the victims across county lines. Additional charges were filed in January 2026 as the investigation continued. There is a line in the indictment that reads, drawn from the public filing, that the property was used as a staging and holding location in connection with a broader scheme of unlawful restraint. Federal prosecutors didn't elaborate on the scheme's scope in the initial filing. That language means the investigation hadn't yet determined how large the network actually was. As of the filing date, it hadn't. Here's what matters. The propane delivery anomaly that flagged this property was identified through a routine cross-reference in a fugitive warrant investigation that had nothing to do with the missing women. No one was specifically looking for them at that property. The flag came from a number that didn't fit, 400 gallons in a Florida July, to a building no one was supposed to be living in. An investigator noticed the gap between what the record said and what physics permitted. Everything else followed from that, and it almost didn't follow in time. The task force had been 3 days away from executing a separate warrant operation tied to the fugitive fraud case, the original reason the rural property records had been pulled at all. That operation would have included the farmhouse as a secondary target. If the Amber Alert pursuit on October 14th hadn't forced an early breach, the entry on the farmhouse would have happened on October 17th at the earliest. 87 days had already passed. 3 more days is a number the investigation doesn't discuss in its public filings. The hand-drawn Florida County map was recovered from the main structure of the farmhouse, pinned to the interior of a closet door. 7 pushpins marked locations across Marion, Alachua, Levy, and Putnam counties. Federal investigators photographed and cataloged it on October 14th. It was logged as a significant piece of evidence and submitted to the FBI field office in Jacksonville for analysis. Not all 7 marked locations were accounted for by the investigation. 4 of the pushpin sites corresponded to locations that investigators were able to associate with the case: properties, intersections, or addresses linked to Subject 2 or to Knowles through cell data, financial records, or vehicle movement. The remaining 3 locations had no documented connection to any person or event identified in the investigation as of the January 2026 indictment filing. 3 pushpins on a hand-drawn map. 3 locations that the investigation couldn't explain. The FBI's Jacksonville field office didn't issue a public statement about the map. The existence of the map was referenced in the indictment as evidence of planning, without specifics. The investigators assigned to those 3 locations worked them through the winter. One was identified in February 2026 as a storage facility in Putnam County that had been rented under a name matching one of the dead person identities in the Knowles network. The unit had been cleaned out, wiped, professionally, with bleach. Investigators recovered trace biological material that was sent to the FBI laboratory in Quantico. Results, as of the date the federal case entered its plea phase, had not been publicly released. The remaining 2 pushpin locations remain unresolved. Before Subject 2 entered his plea, federal investigators conducted 2 formal interviews with him in the presence of his attorney, under a proffer agreement that limited the use of his statements in subsequent proceedings. The first interview lasted 4 hours and 40 minutes. The second lasted 2 hours and 15 minutes. The content of both interviews is sealed under the terms of the proffer agreement, and neither has been summarized in any public filing. What can be drawn from the court record is narrow. Following the second interview, prosecutors filed a supplemental brief requesting a 30-day extension of the plea deadline. The extension was granted without public explanation. 30 days later, the plea was entered. What happened in those 2 interviews, what Subject 2 said, what investigators asked, what was offered and what was withheld, isn't part of the public record. The 30-day extension suggests that something in the second interview required additional investigative work before prosecutors were prepared to proceed. What that work was and what it produced hasn't been addressed in any document that has entered the public record. We spent a fair amount of time going through the court filings for this case, And what keeps pulling at you is the scale suggested by those two locations versus the scale reflected in the charges. The indictment accounts for the 7 women recovered from the farmhouse and traces the operational role of Subject 2 within a defined geographic area. What it doesn't do is characterize the outer boundary of what the pushpin map might represent. Federal prosecutors charge what they can prove. The map may represent more than they could prove. It may represent more than they yet know. Most federal captivity cases look contained because prosecutors charge the provable perimeter. The question this case leaves open is whether the network Knowles and Subject 2 operated was a local operation or something larger. The evidence is genuinely ambiguous on that, and any honest accounting of this case has to say so. When federal investigators find evidence like that map and can't account for every marker, is that an open investigation doing its job, or does it point to gaps that keep being papered over? That question matters in a case like this one. The plea proceedings for Subject 2 began in February 2026 in the Middle District of Florida. He entered a guilty plea to federal charges on March 3, 2026. Sentencing was scheduled for June of that year. The sentencing was conducted on June 17, 2026. The defendant received a federal sentence consistent with the charges in the indictment. The specific term was reflected in the court's public docket. Victims' advocates were present. Family members of the recovered women attended and submitted written statements. Renata Olave's mother submitted a statement that ran to 4 pages. None of it was read into the public record at the defendant's request. The judge allowed it as sealed exhibit. That choice, a 4-page statement sealed from public record at the defendant's request, sits uncomfortably in a case like this one. The victims had already spent 87 days with their voices taken away. The question of whether the legal process restored those voices fully is one where reasonable people and reasonable legal scholars will land differently. That isn't a political position. It's what the record shows. The white Dodge van registered to the Levy County landscaping entity was located on December 3, 2025, at a storage yard in Citrus County, Florida, approximately 60 miles from the farmhouse. It had been there since at least late October, based on the yard's intake log. A search warrant was executed. The van's cargo area had been cleaned. Investigators recovered trace material consistent with the farmhouse cellar and submitted samples to the FBI laboratory. The van was cataloged and held as evidence. Its full evidentiary significance wasn't addressed in the March 2026 plea proceedings. Prosecutors indicated in a court filing that the van's history remained under active investigation as of that date. The propane supplier, for its part, voluntarily provided all billing and delivery records to investigators within 72 hours of the October 14th raid. The account linked to the farmhouse had made 7 total propane purchases across 18 months, totaling approximately 1,800 gallons. For a property classified as vacant, that volume of fuel represents a significant operational footprint. The supplier's account representative stated in a voluntary interview that nothing in the transaction pattern had flagged for review under the company's internal processes, because each individual purchase, looked at alone, was within the range of normal agricultural property usage. The anomaly was only visible in aggregate, and the aggregate was only visible when someone pulled all the records together and looked at the total. That's how most of these cases work. The data is there. The pieces exist. The gap between them and a coherent picture is investigative time and the decision to look. The surveillance camera footage from the Inverness propane dealer, the image of the man who opened the account in April 2024, the man who wasn't Knowles and wasn't Dutro, was submitted to the U.S. Marshals Service Fugitive Unit. A comparison against existing warrant databases didn't produce an immediate match. The image was entered into the federal facial recognition referral process, which is subject to independent legal review before results can be used in an investigation. As of March 2026, the identity of the man in the propane dealer footage hadn't been publicly confirmed. That individual, whoever he is the third actor in this case whose existence is documented and whose accountability isn't yet resolved. 2 people are accounted for. Knowles is dead. Subject 2 is sentenced. The person who opened the account that funded the operation's fuel supply, who sat across a dealer counter in Inverness and signed a name, hasn't been identified. The hand-drawn map with 2 unexplained pushpin locations was recovered from a property connected to those same actors. The Dodge van with its cleaned cargo area is sitting in an evidence yard in Citrus County. The investigation is described in court filings as ongoing. Renata Olave didn't speak publicly in the immediate aftermath of her recovery. Her family released a brief written statement through the Marion County Sheriff's Office Victim Services Office, acknowledging her return and asking for privacy. She had been reported missing 87 days earlier. She had been found. The statement said she was focused on her recovery. In March 2026, 5 months after the raid, she appeared at a community event in Newberry, organized by her former colleagues at the hospice facility where she had worked. She didn't speak at a microphone. She stood in the back of the room. According to the event organizer, she stayed for about an hour. She wore a blue cardigan. Someone who knew her from the hospice said she looked thinner, but that she had laughed twice during the event. Once at something a colleague said, once at something that happened near the food table that no one else seemed to catch. The person who described it said it was the laugh she had always had. Exactly that laugh, unchanged. The other 6 women recovered from the farmhouse aren't identified in any public court filing. Their names are sealed under victim protection provisions. Their ages are listed collectively in a single line of the indictment. Federal victim advocates assigned to the case confirmed that all 7 received ongoing support services. No further details are part of the public record. 6 women whose recovery generated 4 lines of clinical notation in a federal indictment, whose names won't appear in search results, whose families can't speak publicly about what the 87 days cost them without risking the victim protection provisions that keep them sealed from further exposure. The law protects them by making them invisible in the record. That isn't a flaw. It's the law working as designed. It's still worth noting. The town of Newberry held a second vigil in November 2025, not for a missing person this time, but for a return. The crowd was smaller than the first one. Some of the same people came. Someone brought the same photograph that had been circulated on the missing persons flyer. This time they put it on a table instead of stapling it to a telephone pole. A propane delivery to a vacant property was the anomaly. A fugitive fraud warrant created the circumstance in which someone checked rural property records. A deputy on Highway 40 at 4:47 in the morning caught a dark gray pickup running a stop sign. Those 3 elements, the propane record, the routine warrant check, the traffic stop, had to align for the raid to happen when it did. Remove any one of them and the timeline shifts. By how much is a question no one in the investigation is positioned to answer publicly. There's something about the hand-drawn map, the 7 pushpins, the careful county boundaries sketched in by hand, the 2 locations the investigation couldn't account for, that resists easy conclusions. Federal investigators documented it, photographed it, and submitted it into evidence. Then they went to work on the locations it marked. 4 of 7 resolved. 3 of 7 didn't, or not fully. A map like that exists because someone planned. Planning at that level of geographic specificity, hand-drawn, county by county, 7 locations, suggests a scope that the individual prosecution of Subject 2 may not have fully captured. The Marion County Farmhouse is a vacant agricultural property again. The management company terminated the rental agreement after the October raid. The padlock on the back hallway door was removed as evidence. The property sat on the market for the following months, listed at below assessed value. As of late July 2026, it hadn't found a buyer. Subject 2 is in federal custody serving his sentence. The man in the propane dealer footage hasn't been publicly identified. The Dodge van sits in Citrus County evidence storage. 2 pushpins on a hand-drawn map correspond to locations that federal investigators haven't publicly resolved. The propane account is closed. The investigative file